Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about a very surprising statement made by President Putin. He's come out and said that Russia is now planning to cut its military spending next year and for the following 3 years. So, this is the first time that we've seen President Putin making any sort of statements like this about defense spending because, as you'll be aware, because of the war in Ukraine, Russia has been rapidly increasing the amount that it's been spending on defense. And I think what this tells us is that there is real pressure on the Russian budget. President Putin, up until now, has considered defense spending to be sacrosanct. It's the one thing that comes first on the agenda. That's what he's looking to invest first every single year. And then the rest is basically made up of all of the pros and cons as to what's left. However, the fact that Russia has now come out and said that it's going to cut back on its defense spending tells you that there are massive problems at the moment with regards to the amount of cash that Russia has. And if we have a look at this chart, it shows Russia's military spending over the past 5 years. So you can see that back in 2020, Russia spent just under $62 billion. That is a large amount. And that was equivalent of 4.1% of GDP, which is a big number. I'll come on to talk about what's going on with NATO later in the video, but Donald Trump has said that all of NATO needs to have a target of 5%, so 4.1% is high. Now, in 2021, which was the year before Russia invaded Ukraine, the figure was 65.9 billion, so an increase of over $4 billion. But in percentage terms, compared to what was going on with GDP, which at that point was rising quite rapidly for Russia. Russia was enjoying a very healthy period for the economy in 21. It only equated to 3.6%, which is still a reasonable number. Now, in 2022, which was the year when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in February, the increase in military spending rose above $100 billion. So the total amount invested was over $102 billion. And that equated to 4.6% of GDP. And that was the highest number for the previous 3 years. Now, in 2023, that figure increased further to just under 110 billion, equating to 5.4% of GDP, which was the highest percentage up until that year. And then in 2024, the figure was increased hugely to just under $150 billion. So that represented more than 2.5 times what Russia had been spending in 2020. And in terms of the percentage of GDP, it was over 7%. Now that is a very big number. So you can see from this chart that in the past 5 years, spending on defense hasn't been a problem for Russia. They've been increasing rapidly every single year to keep the war in Ukraine going. Now, obviously, the war is still going on, and it's really interesting that President Putin has now come out and said, we've decided to cut back on military spending because that's not the trend as to what's been happening. Now, if we compare the amount that Russia is investing into defense to the top 10 countries in the world, I thought this was interesting to have a look at. You can see that the United States is the clear leader in terms of the amount that it is spending on defense, just under $1 trillion in 2024, 997 billion. And in terms of how that relates to GDP, it's 3.4%. So that's less than what Russia's spending in percentage terms, but it's materially more in terms of US dollars. China is the world's second biggest investor into defense. In 2024, it spent $314 billion, but that only equated to 1.7% of China's GDP. Russia came in at number 3 on this chart with 149 billion. We've just talked about 7.1% of GDP. Germany is number 4 with over 88 billion invested into defense, but only accounted for 1.9% of its GDP. India comes in at number 5 with 86 billion, 2.3%. The United Kingdom also invested 2.3%, and that was 82 billion. Saudi Arabia was number 7 with 80 billion. Interestingly, 7.3% of GDP. So that's the highest out of the top 7. However, beating that percentage by a country mile is Ukraine, which invested 34% of its GDP into defence. That was around 65 billion. France comes in at number 9 with 2.1%, and Japan, number 10, with 1.4%. And if we have a look at a different way of looking at that top 10, we'll just look at the percentage of GDP. You can see that Ukraine is right at the top of the list, not surprisingly, because Ukraine doesn't have the biggest GDP, but it does have a major problem at the moment that it's involved in an active war. So it's spending a lot of money defending itself, 34% of GDP. The second highest, interestingly, in percentage of GDP terms, is Oman in the Middle East. And they're spending just under 10% of their GDP on defence. Israel's number 3 with 8.8%, followed by Algeria, Saudi Arabia. Russia comes in at number 6 on this list, but it's 7.1%. Azerbaijan is number 7, Georgia number 8, Kuwait number 9, and Poland number 10. So Russia is up there in the top 10 of both the amount being spent, it's number 3, and the percentage of GDP, it's number 6. So it's a massive investment. And I think that's why it's such a surprise that President Putin has come out and made this statement that they're now going to cut back on defense spending, because from a geopolitical point of view, things are actually getting worse. The risk of more war happening in the near future is high. It's highly elevated compared to the previous 30 or 40 years in history, because we've got conflicts that are sparking up around the globe, and there is a risk that other countries could get drawn in. We recently saw the events in Iran. We've seen what's been going on in Israel and the Gaza Strip. We've also got what's going on in Ukraine and some instances in Africa. So there's a number of different situations that are bubbling under. And as a result of that, the USA has been encouraging NATO to increase the amount that it's investing into defence. And I thought this chart was interesting. It shows the split of NATO's investment into defence between 2014 and 2024. The scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in trillions of US dollars. It goes from 0 at the bottom to 1.5 trillion at the top. That's a big number. And you can see that there are 2 different colours on these bar charts. The orange section is the amount being spent by the United States, and the grey section is the amount being spent by the rest of NATO, which is basically Europe and Canada. And you can see that the USA has been investing a significant amount more than all of the other countries combined. In fact, it's around, back in 2014, it was around 3/4 of all of the investment into NATO defence was made by the United States. Now, that percentage has come down a little, but of the 1.3 trillion invested in 2024, the USA was almost $1 trillion of that. So it's still representing more than 2/3 of the total amount being spent by NATO. And as a result of that, Donald Trump has said that the other members of NATO need to step up, or there is a risk that they won't actually receive the support from the USA. And so he set a target of 5% for all of the countries in NATO to hit. And if we look at how it compares, these 2 lines here, the green line shows the other countries in NATO excluding the USA. And on average, they're investing around 2%. So obviously 5% is 2.5 times that. That's a significant increase. And the USA is currently at 3.4%. So 5% is also quite a significant increase. It's a 50% increase for the USA as well. So what we're seeing here is that the NATO countries are making a commitment to actually double down, to increase the amount that they're investing into defense, at the same time as President Putin in Russia is saying that he's going to cut back. And I think that tells us a massive story that Russia can't afford to keep spending at the current rates, because when everybody else is increasing the amount they're investing into defense, you would have expected Russia to be doing the same, especially because they're involved in an active war at the moment. And if we look at the breakdown of the different countries in NATO to see where they are at the moment in terms of the percentage they're investing, you can see that Poland is actually at the top of this list. It's now over 4% of its GDP going into defence. And Poland is obviously a neighbor of Russia, and there's a long-standing history there in terms of the conflict. So Poland, I think, is very concerned that Russia is still looking to expand its horizons to possibly launch more invasion of new territory. So Poland is worried about that. We've got Estonia and Latvia who are also up here. You can see on this chart what we've got is the difference between 2014 and 2024. So you can see that every country on this chart has increased the amount it's spending in percentage terms of GDP over the last 10 years, but nobody's got to that 5% line, which is shown on the far right-hand side of this chart. So Estonia and Latvia come in at 2 and 3 here. We've got the USA currently at 3.4%. They're aiming to increase that. Sorry, they've reduced that in the USA. They've come back down from over 3.5%, but they're still ahead of the majority of NATO, apart from Poland, Estonia, and Latvia. We've then got a number of other countries, Lithuania, Greece, and then the NATO average at the moment is around about 2.5%. And you can see that some countries are around about that average: Denmark, United Kingdom, Finland, Romania, Sweden, Norway, Hungary. And then if we go down to the bottom of this list, you can see that some of the countries are actually spending less than 2%. So we've got Croatia, Montenegro, Italy, Portugal, Canada, Slovenia, Luxembourg, Belgium, and then Spain is right at the bottom of this list. And they're spending less than 1.5% of their GDP on defense. And President Trump has actually come out recently and said that Spain is running the risk of basically being kicked out of NATO, that they would no longer be able to rely upon the support of NATO if they don't start increasing the amount that they're spending on defense. So what we're seeing here is a very strong message from the USA to the rest of NATO that everybody really needs to up their game, start investing more into defense, because the risk of something happening is much higher today. But it's fascinating that President Putin is doing the opposite to what every other country in the world is doing. And the reason for that is because Russia can't afford to keep spending the amount that it's been spending historically on defense. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the recent statement by President Putin was really quite surprising, given the fact that Russia is still in the middle of its war in Ukraine. And what we've seen over the last 5 years is that Russia has been increasing the amount that it's investing into defense, mainly because it's using a lot of the equipment. It's spending money on missiles and drones and tanks and lots of other things that have actually been used in the war in Ukraine that are now redundant and they need to be replaced. So there's a constant replenishment factor, but also Russia is still pushing forward in terms of its active defense of all of those areas that it's taken over in Ukraine. So there is a strong demand for a continued high investment into defense in Russia. And we've seen a massive increase over the past 5 years from around $60 billion to $150 billion per year. That is a large amount. And in percentage of GDP terms, it's up to over 7%. But President Putin has now come out and said that Russia has decided that it's going to start reducing the amount that it's spending on defense for the next 3 years. And I think that is hugely surprising, particularly given the fact that NATO, which are basically the opposite to Russia. One of the reasons why Russia says that it invaded Ukraine was because they didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. They didn't want NATO along the border of Russia being able to set up missiles and tanks and bases. Essentially, if there was a conflict with Russia, that would obviously be beneficial to NATO. Russia did not want that to happen. But what Russia is seeing right now is that NATO, under the instruction of Donald Trump, has agreed to increase the amount that it's investing into defense to 5%, which is around double what's been invested historically. And for some countries, it's 2 or 3 or 4 times what they've been investing. So we're seeing NATO ramping up at the same time as President Putin has now said, we're going to cut back on defense. And the only logical explanation as to why Russia has done that is because it doesn't have the cash to keep doubling down on the investment into defense. So we've talked about the National Wealth Fund a lot, but it's been severely depleted over the past 3 years. When the war in Ukraine started, the liquid part of the National Wealth Fund was sitting at around $150 billion. It's now down to around $30 billion. And if Russia keeps spending at the current levels, it's going to be depleted by the end of 2025. So I think the reality of the situation is now kicking in for President Putin, and he's had to admit that he can't afford to keep investing into defense at the same rates as Russia has been doing historically. And this really tells us that there are major problems in the Russian economy right now because, as I said at the start of today's video, defense has been the primary objective from Russia's point of view. It's the number one thing on the list that Russia's investing into each year, and then everything else is coming out of what's left in the budget. So the fact that defense spending is now being reduced tells us that Russia is really struggling to keep funding everything that it needs to invest into, and defense is now going to be scaled back. And the big question is, will this lead to some form of peace settlement in Ukraine? Is Russia now looking to actually end the conflict so that it doesn't have to keep investing $150 billion per year into all of the equipment? Or is this just a reflection of the fact that Russia simply can't afford it, but it may keep the war going at the same time? And then that will raise the question as to what Russia will be able to do. Will it still be able to maintain the same level of offense that it has done historically, or will it have to scale things back? And what will that do in terms of the conflict itself? So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. And thank you so much to everyone that supported me, either through Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube Super Thanks or Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership. Thank you for your support, really appreciate it. And here's something to put a smile on your face.